cold penetrated through the thin cotton uniforms as 23 Japanese women huddled together in the makeshift holding area near Naha, Okinawa. August 1945 had brought an end to the bloodiest battle of the Pacific War, but for these women, the true terror was just beginning, or so they believed. Fumiko Nakamura pressed her back against the corrugated metal wall, feeling every ridge through her torn clothing. Her hands trembled uncontrollably, not entirely from the cold. Around her, women whispered prayers to their ancestors, preparing their spirits for what they had been taught since childhood would come next. The Americans had arrived. The demons were here. For years, the Imperial Japanese government had painted a picture of American soldiers that would haunt the nightmares of every citizen. They were Kichiku Beye, the American and British demons, creatures of unspeakable cruelty who would commit atrocities beyond imagination. Every radio broadcast, every newspaper article, every poster plastered on school walls had reinforced this singular message. Death was infinitely preferable to capture by these monsters. Fumiko remembered her teacher, Sensei Yamamoto, standing before the classroom in 1942, his face grave as he described what Americans did to captured Japanese. The details were too horrific for her young mind to fully process, but the fear had embedded itself deep in her consciousness. She was 12 years old then. Now, at 15, she was about to discover if those lessons were true. The propaganda machine that had shaped Fumiko's worldview was one of the most comprehensive and effective in modern history. From 1941 onwards, the Japanese government orchestrated a campaign of psychological conditioning that reached every corner of the empire. Children learned to fear Americans before they learned to read complex kanji. Mothers taught their daughters that honor lay in death, not survival. Fathers instructed their sons that capture meant eternal shame for 7 generations. The imagery was deliberately dehumanizing. Propaganda posters showed American soldiers with grotesque features, hidden horns beneath their helmets, claws instead of hands. One particularly widespread poster depicted an American GI tearing apart a Japanese family, his face twisted into a demonic snarl. These weren't presented as metaphors. Many Japanese civilians genuinely believed Americans were supernatural beings of pure evil. Radio Tokyo broadcast daily programs describing alleged American atrocities in occupied territories. Announcers with solemn voices recounted fabricated stories of torture, mutilation, and desecration. The broadcasts were mandatory listening in schools, factories, and public spaces. Repetition bred belief. By 1945, the average Japanese civilian had heard thousands of hours of anti-American propaganda. The educational system served as the primary vehicle for this indoctrination. Textbooks portrayed Americans as racially inferior barbarians who lacked the spiritual purity of the Japanese people. Students memorized passages describing American moral corruption and savage nature. Teachers conducted drills where children practiced suicide techniques to avoid capture. This wasn't hyperbole or exaggeration. This was official curriculum, approved at the highest levels of government. The concept of gyokusai, or honorable death, became central to Japanese civilian identity during the war's final years. The term literally meant jewel smashing, referring to the idea that it was better to be a shattered jewel than an intact tile. Death with honor surpassed life with shame. This philosophy would have catastrophic consequences as American forces advanced across the Pacific. Saipan provided the first horrifying demonstration of propaganda's power. In June and July 1944, as American forces secured the island, thousands of Japanese civilians made their way to the northern cliffs at Marpi Point. Families held hands as they jumped together into the sea hundreds of feet below. Mothers threw their children off the cliffs before following them into the void. Fathers detonated grenades, killing their entire families in an instant. American soldiers watched in horror, unable to prevent the mass suicide. They used loudspeakers to broadcast messages in Japanese, promising safety and humane treatment. They sent Japanese-American interpreters to plead with civilians to surrender. Nothing worked. The propaganda had done its job too well. These people genuinely believed that jumping to their deaths was the merciful option compared to what awaited them in American hands. The official count at Saipan recorded over 1,000 civilian suicides, but the true number was likely much higher. Bodies washed out to sea or were never recovered from the rocky shoreline. Survivors who were eventually convinced to surrender reported that Japanese soldiers had actively encouraged the suicides, sometimes at gunpoint. The military distributed grenades to civilian families specifically for this purpose. Okinawa witnessed an even greater tragedy on a massive scale. The battle for the island, lasting from April to June 1945, resulted in the deaths of between 40,000 and 150,000 Okinawan civilians. While many died in the crossfire of combat, a substantial portion perished through suicide or were killed by Japanese soldiers who viewed surrender as treason. The Japanese military had fortified Okinawa with the expectation that civilians would fight to the death alongside soldiers. Propaganda intensified in the months before the American invasion. Loudspeakers in every village broadcast messages about American brutality. Local officials distributed cyanide capsules and instructed families on how to kill themselves quickly. Children as young as 6 were taught to attack American soldiers with bamboo spears. When American forces landed, many Okinawan families retreated into caves with Japanese soldiers. As the battle turned against Japan, these caves became death traps. Rather than surrender, families used grenades to commit collective suicide. In some cases, Japanese soldiers killed civilians who attempted to surrender, viewing them as traitors to the empire. The caves of Okinawa became mass graves, filled with the bodies of entire families who died believing they were protecting their honor. American forces were unprepared for this level of civilian resistance and self-destruction. Intelligence reports had warned of Japanese military fanaticism, but the extent of civilian indoctrination shocked even hardened combat veterans. Psychological warfare units worked frantically to develop messages that might penetrate the propaganda barrier, but with limited success during the battle itself. The women in that holding area near Naha were survivors of this nightmare. They had not jumped from cliffs or detonated grenades. They had not attacked American soldiers with farming implements. Through circumstance, chance, or conscious choice, they had survived to face what they believed would be a fate worse than death. Fumiko had worked as a nurse's assistant in a military hospital on Okinawa. She was too young for formal nursing training, but the desperate shortage of medical personnel meant that anyone with steady hands and a strong stomach could find work tending to wounded soldiers. She had seen horrors in that hospital that would haunt her for the rest of her life. Men with limbs torn off by artillery, soldiers with their faces burned beyond recognition, boys her own age dying slowly from infected wounds because there were no antibiotics left. When the hospital was overrun by American forces, Fumiko had hidden in a supply closet, waiting for death. She heard gunfire and shouting. She heard American voices, harsh and foreign. She waited for them to find her, to do the terrible things she had been taught they would do. Instead, an American medic had opened the closet door, seen a terrified teenage girl, and simply said something in English she didn't understand. His tone was gentle. He held out his hand. Against every instinct, every lesson, every warning, she had taken it. Now she sat with 22 other women who had similar stories. Some had been factory workers in munitions plants. Others had been administrative staff at military installations. A few were simply civilians who had been in the wrong place when the battle ended. All of them had expected to die. All of them were now prisoners of the demons they had feared their entire lives. The sun had set hours ago and the temperature had dropped significantly. Okinawa's subtropical climate could be deceptively cold at night, especially in August when the humidity was high. The women wore only the thin cotton uniforms or civilian clothes they had been captured in. No one had eaten since morning. No one had been given water since afternoon. They sat in silence, waiting. Footsteps approached from outside the holding area. Heavy boots on gravel. American boots. The women tensed as one, pressing closer together. This was it. This was when the torture would begin. Fumiko closed her eyes and prayed to her grandmother's spirit for strength to endure what was coming. The door opened. A young American soldier entered, probably no more than 20 years old. He carried something bundled in his arms. In the dim light from the single bulb hanging from the ceiling, Fumiko couldn't make out what it was. The soldier looked at the huddled women and something like sadness crossed his face. He spoke in English, words none of them understood. Then he approached the nearest woman and held out what he was carrying. It was a blanket, a thick olive-drab military blanket. The woman stared at it as if it were a poisonous snake. The soldier gently placed it in her lap and moved to the next woman. He had brought blankets for all of them. Fumiko felt the weight of the blanket as it was placed across her shoulders. The fabric was rough but warm. The soldier's hands had been gentle, careful not to touch her more than necessary. He had looked at her face for just a moment, and in his eyes she had seen not cruelty or lust or hatred, but something that looked almost like concern. The soldier left, returning moments later with more blankets. He made 3 trips in total, ensuring every woman had at least 1 blanket. Some had 2. He brought a bucket of water and a ladle, setting it in the center of the room where everyone could reach it. Then he left, closing the door behind him. The women sat in stunned silence. Fumiko pulled the blanket tighter around her shoulders, feeling warmth seep into her cold limbs. Her mind struggled to process what had just happened. This wasn't torture. This wasn't cruelty. This was kindness. This was care. This was the opposite of everything she had been taught to expect. One of the older women began to cry, not from fear or pain, but from confusion and relief, and the sudden, overwhelming realization that perhaps everything they had been told was a lie. If the Americans weren't demons, if they brought blankets instead of bringing torture, then what else had been a lie? How many people had died on those cliffs believing lies? How many families had destroyed themselves based on propaganda? The cognitive dissonance was almost physically painful. Fumiko's entire worldview, constructed carefully over 15 years of education and indoctrination, had just been shattered by a simple act of human decency. A blanket. That was all it took. 1 blanket, offered without expectation or demand, had done more to undermine Japanese propaganda than 1,000 American bombs. The treatment the women received in the following days and weeks continued to contradict everything they had been taught. They were moved to a proper prisoner of war camp, a facility that had been hastily constructed to house the thousands of Japanese civilians and soldiers who had surrendered or been captured during the Battle of Okinawa. The camp was organized according to the standards set by the Geneva Convention, the international agreement that governed the treatment of prisoners of war. The United States, unlike Japan, was a signatory to this convention and took its obligations seriously, at least as a matter of official policy. The reality on the ground sometimes fell short of the ideal, but the gap between American treatment of Japanese prisoners and Japanese treatment of Allied prisoners was vast and undeniable. Each morning began with a meal, not a feast but adequate food. Rice, sometimes with vegetables, occasionally fish or meat. The portions were measured and consistent. For women who had spent the last months of the war surviving on increasingly meager rations as Japan's supply lines collapsed, the regular meals were almost luxurious. Some of the women had been on the edge of starvation when they were captured. Within weeks, they began to regain weight and strength. Medical care was provided by American military doctors and medics. Fumiko, with her hospital experience, was eventually asked to assist with translation and basic care for other Japanese prisoners. She watched as American doctors treated wounds, provided medicine, and showed the same professional care to Japanese prisoners that they would to American soldiers. This was perhaps the most shocking revelation of all. In the Japanese military system, medical care was often denied to those deemed unworthy or whose treatment would consume resources better used elsewhere. Fumiko had seen doctors in the Okinawa hospital refuse to treat soldiers whose wounds were too severe, saving precious supplies for those who might return to combat. The concept of treating enemy prisoners with the same standard of care as one's own soldiers was completely foreign to her experience. The barracks where the women slept were simple but adequate, wooden structures with raised floors to keep out moisture and pests. Each woman had a cot with a mattress and blankets. There were latrines with basic sanitation, a vast improvement over the conditions many had endured during the battle. There were even facilities for bathing, with water heated by the sun in large drums. The daily routine included work assignments, but these were light labor, not the brutal forced work that Japanese forces had imposed on Allied prisoners. Women might be assigned to help with laundry, food preparation, or camp maintenance. The work was supervised but not harsh. Guards did not beat prisoners for working too slowly. There were no torture sessions for minor infractions. The contrast with stories of Allied prisoners working on the Burma Railway or in Japanese labor camps was stark and undeniable. Prisoners were allowed recreation time. They could talk freely among themselves, though conversations with guards were limited by language barriers. Some women formed small groups to practice traditional songs or crafts. The camp administration even provided materials for these activities. recognizing that maintaining morale and mental health among prisoners served everyone's interests. Religious services were permitted. Buddhist and Shinto practices were allowed, within the constraints of the camp environment. This was particularly significant because Japanese propaganda had claimed that Americans would forbid all Japanese religious and cultural practices, forcing prisoners to convert to Christianity or face execution. The reality was that American authorities, while not always understanding Japanese religious practices, generally respected them as long as they didn't interfere with camp operations. Perhaps most surprisingly, prisoners were allowed to write letters home. These letters were censored, of course, to prevent transmission of military intelligence, but personal messages were permitted. For many women, this was the first opportunity to let their families know they were alive. The propaganda had taught them that captured soldiers and civilians would simply disappear, never to be heard from again. The ability to communicate with loved ones was another crack in the propaganda wall. The letters that made it through to Japan had a profound impact. Families who received word that their daughters or sisters were alive and being treated humanely began to question other aspects of the government's narrative. If the Americans weren't torturing and killing prisoners, what else might be untrue? This grassroots erosion of propaganda's credibility would play a role in Japan's post-war transformation. The American Guards themselves were a diverse group, representing the full spectrum of American society. Some were career soldiers, professionals who took their duties seriously. Others were draftees who had never wanted to be in the military, and certainly never wanted to be guarding prisoners on a devastated island, thousands of miles from home. Their attitudes toward their Japanese prisoners varied considerably. Some guards harbored deep hatred for the Japanese. They had lost friends or family at Pearl Harbor, or in the brutal island-hopping campaign across the Pacific. They had seen the bodies of American prisoners who had been tortured and executed by Japanese forces. They had witnessed the suicides at Saipan and Okinawa, and struggled to understand a culture that would choose death over surrender. For these men, treating Japanese prisoners humanely required conscious effort and discipline. Other guards were more sympathetic. They recognized that the women in their charge were not soldiers, but civilians caught in circumstances beyond their control. They saw teenagers like Fumiko and thought of their own sisters or daughters back home. They understood that propaganda and indoctrination had shaped these women's expectations and fears. These guards went out of their way to be kind, to demonstrate through actions that Americans were not the demons of Japanese propaganda. One guard, a sergeant from Iowa named Robert Miller, made it his personal mission to learn basic Japanese phrases. His pronunciation was terrible, and he often got words hilariously wrong, but the effort itself communicated something important. He was trying to bridge the gap, to establish human connection across the divide of language and culture and war. Years later, in interviews conducted by historians, several women who had been in that camp remembered Sergeant Miller and his mangled Japanese with fondness. The official policy from the highest levels of American military command was clear. Prisoners would be treated in accordance with the Geneva Convention and American values. This wasn't purely altruistic. There were strategic calculations involved. The United States was planning for the post-war occupation of Japan and recognized that humane treatment of prisoners would facilitate that process. There was also the matter of reciprocity. American prisoners were being held in Japanese camps, and there was hope, however faint, that good treatment of Japanese prisoners might encourage better treatment of Americans. But beyond strategy, there was also a genuine belief among American leadership that how a nation treated its enemies said something fundamental about its character. General Douglas MacArthur, who would soon become the supreme commander of the Allied occupation of Japan, believed that demonstrating American values through actions would be more effective than any propaganda campaign. Treating prisoners humanely was not just policy, it was a statement about what America stood for. This didn't mean that every American soldier or guard lived up to these ideals. There were incidents of abuse, theft, and mistreatment. Some guards used their positions to exploit prisoners. Some harbored such hatred that they found ways to make prisoners' lives miserable within the bounds of official policy. The American military justice system prosecuted some of these cases, though not all. The system was imperfect, as all human systems are, but the overall pattern was clear and undeniable. Japanese prisoners in American custody had a survival rate of over 97%. Allied prisoners in Japanese custody had a survival rate of approximately 73%. This 24 percentage point difference represented tens of thousands of lives. The statistics told a story that no amount of propaganda could obscure. For Fumiko and the other women in the camp, the daily experience of humane treatment gradually eroded the fear and hatred that propaganda had instilled. It was a psychological process that happened slowly, almost imperceptibly. The first blanket had created shock and confusion. The first adequate meal had raised suspicions of poisoning or some trick. The first kind word from a guard had been met with incomprehension. But day after day, week after week, the pattern held. The Americans were not demons. They were men, with the full range of human qualities. Some were kind, some were indifferent, a few were cruel. But as a group and as a matter of policy, they treated their prisoners with basic human dignity. This consistent reality eventually overwhelmed the propaganda narrative. The transformation in the prisoners' attitudes was documented in intelligence reports compiled by American psychological warfare units. These reports noted that Japanese prisoners, after a period of adjustment, often became cooperative and even friendly. They provided information about Japanese military dispositions and tactics. They helped translate documents and interrogate newly captured prisoners. Some even volunteered to broadcast messages to Japanese forces still fighting, urging them to surrender. This cooperation wasn't the result of torture or coercion. It was the natural human response to being treated with decency and respect. People who expected to be tortured and killed but instead were given blankets and food and medical care experienced a profound shift in perspective. The enemy who showed them kindness became, if not a friend, at least no longer a demon. Fumiko found herself in an especially complex position. Her work as a medical assistant gave her more interaction with American personnel than most prisoners had. She worked alongside American medics, learning English medical terms and procedures. She saw American doctors work themselves to exhaustion, treating both American and Japanese patients. She witnessed the American Medical Corps' commitment to saving lives, regardless of nationality. One incident particularly affected her. A young Japanese soldier was brought into the medical facility with severe abdominal wounds. He was delirious with pain and fever, crying out for his mother. The American surgeon worked for 3 hours to save his life, using precious blood supplies and antibiotics. When the surgery was over and the soldier was stable, the surgeon sat down heavily, exhausted. Fumiko, assisting with cleanup, heard him mutter to another medic, "Kid's probably 19, same age as my son." That moment crystallized something for Fumiko. The Americans weren't demons or saviors. They were just people, capable of both violence and compassion, shaped by their own propaganda and values, just as she had been shaped by hers. The war had made them enemies, but the war was ending, and what came after would depend on whether people could see past the propaganda to the shared humanity underneath. As summer turned to fall in 1945, news of Japan's surrender reached the camps. The reaction among the prisoners was complex and varied. Some felt relief that the killing was finally over. Others felt shame that Japan had been defeated. Many felt a mixture of emotions too complicated to easily express. But underlying all of it was a growing awareness that the world they had known was gone, and whatever came next would be fundamentally different. The process of repatriation began in late 1945 and continued through 1946 and into 1947. Japanese prisoners were gradually returned to their homeland, a homeland that had been devastated by war and was now under American occupation. The women who returned brought with them stories that contradicted the propaganda narrative. They told their families about blankets and adequate food and medical care. They described American guards who were stern but fair or even kind. These stories spread through communities, contributing to a broader reassessment of the propaganda that had shaped Japanese society during the war. People began to question what else they had been told that wasn't true. If the Americans weren't demons, what about the other claims the government had made? What about the promises of inevitable victory? What about the assertions that the emperor was divine and infallible? This questioning was part of a larger transformation in Japanese society during the occupation period. The American occupation authorities, led by General MacArthur, implemented sweeping reforms designed to democratize Japan and prevent the rise of militarism. These reforms included a new constitution, land reform, educational reform, and the dismantling of the military-industrial complex that had driven Japan to war. The success of these reforms was due in part to the groundwork laid by the humane treatment of prisoners. Japanese civilians had direct evidence that Americans were not the monsters they had been taught to fear. This made it easier to accept American authority during the occupation and to embrace the democratic reforms being implemented. The blankets given to shivering prisoners in 1945 had helped pave the way for the transformation of Japan into a peaceful, democratic nation. Fumiko returned to Japan in March 1946. Her family had survived the war, though their home had been destroyed in the firebombing of Tokyo. They were living in a temporary shelter, struggling to find enough food to survive. When Fumiko told them about her experiences as a prisoner, her father wept. He had believed she was dead. He had been prepared to never see her again. The fact that she was alive, and that she had been treated humanely by the Americans, challenged everything he had believed about the war. In the years that followed, Fumiko trained as a nurse and worked in hospitals during Japan's reconstruction. She married, had children, and lived a long life. In interviews conducted in the 1980s and 1990s, she spoke about her experiences as a prisoner of war. She always came back to that first night, when a young American soldier brought blankets to a group of terrified women who expected torture and death. "That blanket saved my life," she said in one interview. "Not because I would have frozen to death without it, though I might have. It saved my life because it showed me that everything I had been taught was a lie. The Americans were not demons. They were human beings, capable of kindness even toward their enemies. That blanket was the first step in my journey from hatred to understanding." Other women from that camp had similar stories. They spoke of the cognitive dissonance they experienced, the painful process of unlearning propaganda and rebuilding their understanding of the world. They talked about the shame they felt when they thought about the people who had died on the cliffs of Saipan and Okinawa, believing lies. They expressed gratitude for the Americans who had treated them with decency, even as they mourned the devastation the war had brought to their country. The contrast between American and Japanese treatment of prisoners of war is one of the most striking aspects of the Pacific War. While American camps were far from perfect, and individual instances of abuse occurred, the overall policy and practice was one of humane treatment according to international standards. Japanese camps, by contrast, were characterized by systematic brutality, forced labor, starvation, and execution. The Bataan Death March in April 1942 resulted in the deaths of thousands of American and Filipino prisoners who were forced to march 65 miles in tropical heat without adequate food, water, or rest. Those who fell were bayoneted or shot. Survivors of the march were then held in camps where disease, malnutrition, and abuse killed thousands more. The Burma Railway, built by Allied prisoners and Asian laborers under Japanese supervision, resulted in the deaths of approximately 12,000 Allied prisoners and between 40,000 and 100,000 Asian laborers. The conditions were so brutal that the railway became known as the Death Railway. Prisoners worked 16-hour days with minimal food and no medical care. Those who couldn't work were beaten or killed. These atrocities were not the actions of a few rogue soldiers. They were the result of systematic policies that viewed surrender as the ultimate dishonor and treated prisoners as less than human. The Japanese military code of Bushido, as interpreted by the wartime regime, held that soldiers should fight to the death rather than surrender. Those who did surrender, whether Japanese or enemy, were considered to have forfeited their right to humane treatment. The contrast in prisoner mortality rates tells the story in stark statistical terms. Of approximately 95,000 Allied prisoners held by Japan, approximately 27,000 died in captivity, a mortality rate of about 27%. Of approximately 41,000 Japanese prisoners held by the United States, fewer than 1,000 died in captivity, a mortality rate of less than 3%. These numbers represent individual human lives, each with their own story. They represent Allied prisoners who died of starvation, disease, or execution in Japanese camps. They represent Japanese prisoners who survived because they were given adequate food, medical care, and humane treatment in American camps. The numbers are a testament to the power of policy and culture in shaping how nations conduct themselves in war. The women who experienced American captivity became living witnesses to this contrast. They could speak from personal experience about what they had expected and what they had actually encountered. Their testimonies, shared with family and friends and eventually with historians and researchers, contributed to the historical record and to the broader understanding of the Pacific War. In December 1945, the camp where Fumiko was held organized a Christmas celebration. This might seem like a small thing, hardly worth mentioning in the context of a global war, but for the women in the camp, it was another revelation. The American guards decorated the mess hall with handmade ornaments. They prepared a special meal with extra rations. They sang Christmas carols, and some of the Japanese women, including Fumiko, joined in, humming along to melodies they didn't know. One of the guards, Sergeant Miller, had somehow acquired small gifts for the prisoners. Nothing elaborate, a piece of candy, a handkerchief, a small carved wooden figure. He distributed these gifts with a broad smile, wishing each woman Merry Christmas in his terrible Japanese. The women didn't celebrate Christmas. Most had never heard of the holiday before the war, but they understood the gesture. They recognized the attempt to share something meaningful, to create a moment of joy and normalcy in the midst of displacement and uncertainty. Fumiko received a small wooden bird, carved by one of the guards during his off-duty hours. It was simple, rough-hewn, clearly the work of an amateur, but it had been made with care and given with kindness. She kept that wooden bird for the rest of her life. It sat on a shelf in her home in Tokyo, a reminder of the night when enemies celebrated together, when the barriers of language and culture and war were briefly transcended by simple human generosity. The Christmas celebration was documented in the camp records, a brief note in the daily log. But for the women who were there, it was a profound experience. It was another piece of evidence that the propaganda had been wrong. It was another step in the journey from fear and hatred to understanding, and eventually, to reconciliation. The process of repatriation was complex and sometimes difficult. Japan in 1946 was a devastated country. Cities had been reduced to rubble by American bombing. The economy had collapsed. Millions of people were homeless and hungry. The social and political order that had governed Japan for decades had been swept away. Into this chaos came the repatriated prisoners, bringing stories that challenged the narratives that many Japanese still clung to. Some returnees faced suspicion or hostility. In a culture that valued honor above life, those who had surrendered rather than fighting to the death were sometimes viewed with contempt. The fact that they had been treated well by the Americans only made it worse in some eyes, suggesting that they had collaborated or betrayed their country. This was deeply unfair, but it reflected the lingering power of the propaganda and the cultural values that had driven Japan to war. Other returnees found that their stories were welcomed, even sought after. People wanted to know what the Americans were really like. They wanted to understand the enemy who had defeated them and who now occupied their country. The testimonies of former prisoners, describing humane treatment and even kindness, helped to ease fears about the occupation and to create space for the reconciliation that would follow. Fumiko found that her family was eager to hear her stories, but struggled to fully understand them. Her father, who had been a mid-level bureaucrat in the wartime government, had difficulty accepting that the propaganda he had helped to spread was false. Her mother, who had prepared herself for Fumiko's death, was simply grateful to have her daughter back. Her younger brother, who had been too young to serve in the military, was fascinated by her descriptions of American soldiers and wanted to learn English. The long-term impact of these experiences on individual lives is difficult to measure, but undeniably significant. Many former prisoners became advocates for peace and reconciliation. They spoke at schools and community gatherings about their experiences. They emphasized the dangers of propaganda and the importance of seeing enemies as human beings. They contributed to the development of post-war Japan's pacifist culture and its commitment to international cooperation. Some former prisoners maintained contact with American veterans. As the decades passed and the wounds of war began to heal, former enemies became friends. There were reunions where Japanese former prisoners met with American former guards. These meetings were often emotional, filled with tears and embraces and mutual expressions of respect and forgiveness. They represented the best of what humans are capable of, the ability to move beyond hatred and violence to understanding and peace. The lesson of the blanket, as Fumiko called it, extended far beyond the individual women who experienced it. It became a symbol of the power of humane treatment and simple kindness to to transform enemies into friends. It demonstrated that propaganda, no matter how pervasive or intense, could be overcome by direct experience and genuine human connection. It showed that even in the midst of total war, there was room for decency and compassion. The historical significance of American treatment of Japanese prisoners extends to the broader question of how nations conduct themselves in war. The United States was far from perfect in World War II. American forces committed atrocities, though not on the systematic scale of Japanese or German forces. American society was deeply racist, and Japanese Americans were unjustly imprisoned in internment camps. The decision to use atomic weapons on Hiroshima and Nagasaki remains controversial and morally complex. But in the specific matter of prisoner treatment, American policy and practice represented a commitment to international law and basic human rights, even toward an enemy that had shown no such commitment to Allied prisoners. This wasn't naive idealism. It was a calculated decision based on strategic considerations, moral principles, and a belief that how a nation treats its enemies reveals its true character. The contrast between American and Japanese prisoner treatment had profound implications for the post-war order. It contributed to the legitimacy of American authority during the occupation of Japan. It facilitated the war crimes trials that held Japanese leaders accountable for atrocities. It helped to create the conditions for Japan's transformation into a peaceful, democratic nation and a close ally of the United States. In the broader sweep of history, the story of Japanese women prisoners receiving blankets from American guards might seem like a minor footnote. But history is made up of countless individual moments and experiences. The grand narratives of nations and armies and political movements are built on the foundation of individual human interactions. A young soldier deciding to bring blankets to cold prisoners. A teenage girl accepting a hand extended in kindness rather than striking it away in fear. These small moments, multiplied across thousands of individual experiences, shaped the course of history. The propaganda that had convinced Japanese civilians that Americans were demons was powerful and pervasive. It had been built over years through every available medium of communication. It had been reinforced by cultural values and social pressure. It had been backed by the full authority of the state and the threat of punishment for those who questioned it. Breaking through that propaganda wall should have been nearly impossible. But it wasn't impossible. It was accomplished not through counter-propaganda or psychological warfare campaigns, though those played a role. It was accomplished primarily through direct experience and simple human decency. The women who expected torture received blankets. They expected starvation and received adequate food. They expected brutality and received medical care. They expected to be treated as less than human and were treated with basic dignity and respect. This gap between expectation and reality created cognitive dissonance that propaganda could not survive. The women had to choose between believing their direct experience or believing what they had been taught. Most chose to believe their experience. This choice, repeated across thousands of prisoners and eventually communicated to millions of Japanese civilians, contributed to the collapse of the propaganda system and the transformation of Japanese society. The story also reveals something important about the nature of propaganda itself. Propaganda is most effective when it cannot be tested against reality. When people have no direct experience with the subjects of propaganda, they have no basis for questioning it. But when propaganda claims can be tested through direct experience, and when that experience contradicts the propaganda, the entire system becomes vulnerable. The Japanese government had made a fatal error in its propaganda strategy. By claiming that Americans were literally demonic, that they would torture and kill all prisoners without exception, the government created a testable hypothesis. When Japanese prisoners discovered through direct experience that this claim was false, it called into question everything else they had been told. If the Americans weren't demons, what else was a lie? This lesson remains relevant in the modern world. Propaganda continues to be a powerful tool used by governments and other actors to shape public opinion and behavior. The techniques have evolved with technology, but the fundamental principles remain the same: repetition, emotional manipulation, dehumanization of enemies, and control of information. Understanding how propaganda works and how it can be overcome is essential for maintaining free and democratic societies. The women who were prisoners in American camps in 1945 are nearly all gone now. Fumiko Nakamura died in 2003 at the age of 73. Before her death, she gave several interviews to historians and journalists, sharing her experiences and reflecting on their meaning. Her wooden bird, the Christmas gift from Sergeant Miller, was donated to a museum dedicated to the history of the Pacific War and the post-war reconciliation between Japan and the United States. In one of her final interviews, Fumiko was asked what she wanted people to remember about her experiences. She thought for a long moment before answering, "I want people to understand that propaganda can make you believe terrible things about other people. It can make you hate people you've never met. It can make you willing to die rather than face an imaginary horror. But propaganda is fragile. It cannot survive contact with reality. One act of kindness, one blanket given to a cold prisoner can shatter years of lies. That's what I want people to remember. Kindness is more powerful than propaganda. Humanity is stronger than hatred." This message, carried by Fumiko and thousands of others who experienced the gap between propaganda and reality, helped to shape the post-war relationship between Japan and the United States. It contributed to one of the most successful examples of former enemies becoming close allies. The U.S.-Japan alliance, forged in the aftermath of total war, has been a cornerstone of peace and stability in the Pacific for over 75 years. The alliance was built on many factors: strategic interests, economic cooperation, shared democratic values, and effective diplomacy. But underlying all of these was the foundation laid by individuals on both sides who chose humanity over hatred, who extended kindness to enemies, and who were willing to question propaganda and embrace a more complex truth. The blanket given to a cold prisoner in 1945 was a small gesture, but it was part of a larger pattern that changed the world. If this story opened your eyes to a side of history you've never heard before, please hit that like button. It helps more people discover these untold stories. If you're not subscribed yet, consider subscribing and turning on notifications so you never miss our deep dives into the moments that changed history. And I'd love to hear from you in the comments. What surprised you most about this story? Did you know about the gap between propaganda and reality during World War II? Your thoughts and discussions make this community what it is. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.